By the end of the 14th century, Lombard Street had become the financial centre of London. Its name was derived from those Florentine merchants, or Lombards, who had earlier been the chief rivals of the Jews in transacting the financial affairs of Europe. But the ancestors of modern banks in Britain were neither the merchants nor the crown, but the goldsmiths. There were goldsmiths in England important enough to be named in Doomsday, and by 1180 they had a guild of their own in London. In the year 1500, 52 goldsmiths' shops stood in the Strand, and many elsewhere in the city. The history of the Grasshopper is intimately linked with that of the goldsmiths, for under its sign on the site of Martin's Bank's principal London office at 68 Lombard Street, transactions of a banking nature have been continuously conducted for 400 years. The history records how the Grasshopper survived the financial panics which arose at the outbreaks of wars and other national emergencies, how money men developed into goldsmith bankers into private bankers, and private bankers into joint stock bankers. It embraces the whole field of technical development in banking, and shows Martin's direct descent from what is believed to be the oldest banking business in the country. Sir Thomas Gresham, mercer and trusted agent of Mary Tudor and Queen Elizabeth I, has long been considered the first English banker to understand the working of foreign exchange, and is said to have pioneered the financial transactions from which our banking methods are developed. He reported to Queen Elizabeth early in her reign how, by art and God's providence, he had been able, for example, to reduce the burden of interest on royal borrowings in the Antwerp money market. Gresham's surviving daybook reveals that he lent money at 10% to Henry VIII, issued bills of exchange, paid interest on deposits, and exchanged money. But since he was dealing extensively in textiles and other goods, these transactions formed only part of his business. The Grasshopper, from his family's coat of arms, was used as the sign of Gresham's business outside the Lombard Street shop, on his seal, and on the first Royal Exchange on the north side of Cornhill, which he gave to the City of London, and where his crest still acts as a weather vane. It was at Gresham's Royal Exchange and in that neighbourhood that merchants began to hold meetings and agree to underwrite vessels. Today's marine insurance policy is based on an Elizabethan draft. Gresham's daybook refers in 1549 to the purchase of a new house and 3 tenements, thought to be the Grasshopper, the Unicorn, and the 3 crossed daggers. The adjoining buildings were later acquired, thus making up the site on which Martin's principal London office stands today. By 1563, Gresham's banking activities had developed sufficiently for him to be described as court banker to Queen Elizabeth. He raised substantial loans for the Queen on his own credit, and asked Cecil to intercede on his behalf to obtain the return of these funds. On one occasion, the promised interest was given to Gresham without repayment of the principal sum of £5,000, and, in addition and despite all his efforts on her behalf, the Queen reduced his diet or allowance of 20 shillings a day. Gresham must have made his peace with the Queen, for she visited the Royal Exchange, afterwards dining at his house. Several rings like these were made to mark the event. Gresham had difficulty in raising loans abroad on the Queen's credit, and advised her that she must reform the coinage, which her father had debased by reducing its real value to below its face value. In order to persuade her, he formulated Gresham's law, the principle that bad currency drives out good. This was the reason, he told the Queen, why all your fine gold was conveyed out of this your realm. Although not himself a goldsmith, Gresham had frequent dealings with goldsmiths, such as Sir Richard Martin, here shown on a medallion, and his son. This could well have been the beginning of the Martin family's association with the Grasshopper, which has continued to the present day. Richard Martin was Master of the Mint from 1572 until his death 45 years later, and in 1588, the year of the Spanish Armada, served as Lord Mayor and was knighted. This inventory of jewels reminds us that 17th century goldsmiths continued to emerge naturally as part-time bankers, lending money at interest, exchanging money and accepting it with valuables for safekeeping. In the Civil War, when the wealthy of both sides melted their plate into pikes and muskets, the goldsmiths suspended their normal transactions of selling gold and silver to become the merchants' cash keepers, to receive and pay for nothing, few observing or conjecturing the profit they had for their pains. Among those enjoying such profits from the Civil War was probably one Clement Pung, a partner at the Grasshopper, who is known to have deposited Spanish coins with Edward Backwell, his successor. In the Great Fire of London, the Grasshopper building and its records was destroyed, but it was included in Christopher Wren's plan for the new city, and rebuilt by Backwell, who carried on the goldsmith's business there and at the adjoining Unicorn until 1672. Samuel Pepys, who kept an account with him, complains in his diary about the goldsmith's shops, where people are forced to pay 15% or sometimes 20% for their money, which is a most horrid shame, and that which must not be suffered. A good profit could be made by melting down heavy coins for resale as bullion or abroad, and Backwell had his melting chamber behind the Unicorn shop. After the closing of the mint in 1640, we find one origin of the cheque, for the goldsmiths began to receive an increasing number of notes asking them to pay out so much money to such and such a person from the money the writer of the note had lodged with them. They also issued promises to pay, the first banknotes. Pepys complained about the Admiralty's dependence on these bankers, men who had done well out of the troubles of the 40s, which had been unfavourable to foreign trade and the general economy. Backwell's downfall occurred when Charles II stopped the Exchequer and confiscated the £300,000 he had deposited in the Exchange. The king offered him an annuity of £17,000 in settlement of the debt, but Backwell was forced to flee the country to escape his creditors. The fact that goldsmiths were collecting rents from landowners, making loans, and beginning to conduct a regular banking business as we know it, is further confirmed by the Little London Directory of 1677, which contains a list of goldsmiths that keep running cashes, or current accounts as they're now called. Among those are mentioned Charles Duncombe and Richard Kent at the Grasshopper in Lombard Street, the partnership that had succeeded Backwell. Despite his reputation of being London's richest commoner, Duncombe refused James II's request for £1,500 to take him overseas, and as a result was excluded from the pardon which the king issued in exile. Also, although he was an opponent to William III's plan to establish the Bank of England, the Treasury minute books record that Duncombe refused to provide the king with money. Following the formation of the Bank of England in 1684, the first printed cheque was issued. Richard Smith, succeeding Duncombe, is said to have taken an important part in the silvery coinage of 1696, one result of which was that the guinea, which by clipping and other forms of fraud had been passed for 30 shillings, was rated down to 21 and sixpence. Smith took into his service Andrew Stone, whose seal is shown here, and who was described in the registers of St. Mary Woolnoth Church as goldsmith, bookkeeper to Mr. Smith at the Grasshopper. And for the next 150 years, the business was mainly conducted by the Martin and Stone families. Although apprenticed as a goldsmith, Thomas Martin, who became senior partner in 1711, was probably the first at the Grasshopper to be exclusively a banker. The bursting of the South Sea bubble in 1720 caused many a satirical comment. A letter book still in existence refers to a wide variety of banking transactions and the speculation at Garraway's Coffee House, which now forms part of the Grasshopper premises. Although the story of the South Sea Company is hardly relevant to British economic history, the consequences of its failure are an important part, and caused a setback in joint stock methods. While people continued to meet for business and pleasure in the coffee houses, The Grasshopper suffered acutely from the collapse of this project. If we take literally the line of John Gay, when not one guinea chinked on Martin's boards. Thomas took his brother, James Martin I, into partnership, and records for that period mention this little iron chest, still at Lombard Street, as containing £6,000 in gold. In the 18th century, meetings were regularly held for the drawing of lotteries, and the sale of lottery tickets was an important part of the work of the Grasshopper. Tally sticks from that time show that the bank also handled annuities. With the 18th century, we associate elegance, order and richness in a wide variety of arts and crafts. But all was not peace during the Augustan age. At the time of the 45 Rebellion and the 1780 Gordon riots, when an angry mob burnt 70 houses and 4 jails, the bank stood in readiness to protect itself. Early records of the bank are said to have been lost in the Royal Exchange fire, but surviving 18th century documents bring to light various aspects of the organisation of the Grasshopper. Here is a wage receipt signed by Thomas Halifax, later joint founder of Glyn Mills and Company. The clerks, whose wages were supplemented by Christmas money from customers, lived at the bank, and details of their board and other expenses are given in the early accounts of profit and loss. The clerical staff at the Grasshopper numbered 5, and yearly salaries varied between £21 and £70. The porter was paid £6 and the watch £25, bringing the annual salary bill to a total of £222. The partner's remuneration was based upon the number of shares they held in the bank, as specified in the partnership settlement, and the senior was the one holding the lease of the Grasshopper. By advancing money on respondentia bonds based on a ship's cargo, the bank helped to develop 18th century trade with the East. At the time of Joseph Martin, in 1773, the Grasshopper made its first recorded contribution to the London Clearing House, of which he was a founder member. In the list of members, the family name has since appeared continuously. James Martin II, a neighbour of William Pitt, was in charge of the bank at the time of the Napoleonic Wars, but his diaries contain few references to the momentous events of the day. In fact, his principal anxiety seems to have been a daily walk to keep down his weight. His son, John Martin III, was senior partner from 1808 to 1830, at the time of the building of the Royal Mint. He married a member of the Stone family, and it is from this union that all the later Martins, Stones and Normans are descended. George Stone I was senior partner at the time of Queen Victoria's succession, and was followed in 1843 by John Martin IV, who remained in charge for 33 years. Here we have an artist's impressions of the Lombard Street frontage and Baker's Chop House from Change Alley, at the time of the Baring crisis in 1890, when it was rumoured that Martins, clearing bankers to Barings for many years, might be in difficulties. Martins survived the resulting run on the bank, but the next year the partnership was converted into a limited company, Martins Bank Limited. Under the chairmanship of Edward Norman, Martins Bank was acquired in 1918 by the Bank of Liverpool, which was then renamed the Bank of Liverpool and Martins Limited. The incorporation of the Lancashire and Yorkshire Bank in 1928 led to the shortening of this title to the present Martins Bank Limited, whose headquarters today is in Water Street, Liverpool. Robert Holland Martin was chairman when the Grasshopper was again rebuilt in 1930, and there is still a descendant of Andrew Stone working at the Grasshopper today. With over 600 branches, many of them outstanding examples of contemporary design, and with such innovations as a drive-in bank and the electronic processing of daily records, the modern developments of Martins are too numerous to list. The immediate point is that Martins bears a name that has been associated with all the main phases in the evolution of banking.